Good afternoon. It's great to see all the attendance and the interest in this topic. Reaffirms conversations that we're having as Gartner on a daily basis, continue to be proved out not just within the Gartner client base, but also within the general public base. My name is Kyle Hilgendorf. I'm a research director at Gartner in the Gartner for Technical Professionals Research Division. GTP for short is the division at Gartner that really interacts with senior level technologists. So my conversations are very often with the senior level enterprise architects, engineers, those that are tasked with implementing strategic technologies that the CIO pushes down. So I work in tandem with the traditional side of the Gartner research. It's always been doing a very good job interacting with the CIO and the senior level IT decision maker. I'm here to talk about a public infrastructure as a service provider bake-off between Amazon and Microsoft Azure. If you're not familiar with Gartner, we're an objective industry analyst research firm. And objective is the key word. So Amazon did invite me to come speak here, but Amazon was not able to influence my presentation, my research, and so forth. So this is Gartner's objective and unbiased opinion on how Amazon and Microsoft compare for enterprise needs. And I do want to make sure that is clear as well. Gartner is mostly focused on the larger size of organizations. So when I talk about this conversation today, it's really in terms of what do large organizations really need out of public cloud services and public cloud providers. One of the most, perhaps the most common question I am getting today is, should I choose Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure for my cloud service provider? Many times it's for infrastructure as a service, but as we are seeing even this week, and with some of the things that Microsoft has been doing, it's both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. And if I answer that question directly today on this stage, I have to tell you that Amazon's got a lead. It's actually a pretty significant lead right now when we compare a number of different features. And I always like to do that in my presentations, is to give you the answer at the beginning, so if you don't want to listen to me the rest of the time, you can leave. But I contextualize that and say, we have to remember that this race has just begun. It's a very long race. Even though Amazon is coming up on 8 to 10 years of age, in reality, kind of the enterprise grade and production level readiness is only a couple of years. Same with any of the providers in this market. So if we think about it in terms of a marathon, we're still in the very early stages. And so if you follow racing of any kind, that gap can change over time. Furthermore, there's a number of providers giving chase. You've probably seen what Google's been doing. You've probably read about what IBM and SoftLayer have been doing together. Maybe what VMware's doing with vCloud Air, HP, CenturyLink, Dimension Data. There's a number of providers that are trying to play here, but right now it's a two-horse race. And so that's what we're going to talk about, Amazon or Microsoft. We've developed a framework within Gartner called the evaluation criteria, and we've built one for infrastructure as a service providers. It's 205 individual items that a provider will get a yes or a no for. We don't give an it depends or a maybe. We don't kind of straddle that line. We give a yes or a no. And we break those down into required, preferred, and optional. It's a taxonomy we have. Required items are those that we believe through hundreds of conversations, through our analysis and our research, that enterprise and large organizations really do need to run production systems. Now, can you run proof of concept, development and test, and low criticality systems without a lot of those? Absolutely. But you want to start talking about running business applications that are revenue generating, that support mission critical scenarios within your business, you're going to want those required criteria. Preferred are nice to have. A lot of times they're the differentiating factors or where you see a significant gap among providers. And then optional are what we leave for those that we hear enough times within companies and industries that we don't want you to forget about those, but we want to let you decide how important is that to you. So you'll see specific features for government agencies or healthcare providers or financial services, or sometimes they're features that are really bleeding edge or really pushing that envelope. As part of the research package, you get an interactive Excel tool so that you can move these things around. You see something that's required and you really don't need it, then delete it. You want to move an optional item into required, that's fine. You want to add some of your own, that's what we try to do, get you the 80% start so you can build your own evaluation that's contextualized for your company. There's 8 major categories. I've separated kind of the left from the right, the left being the more technical categories and a number of features that we evaluate these providers against. And the right would be those that I would call maybe the soft side of cloud, the non-technical, things that are very important, especially in the larger organizations. If you don't have support, if you don't have some semblance of service levels, if you're not offering management capabilities, if you don't have several different ways to integrate with billing systems and chargeback, and you're going to have a lot of frustrations as a large company and a big adopter of a cloud service. So within each of those 8, then you get that required, preferred, and optional subcategories. That's the evaluation criteria that we build before we assess any providers. The next thing we do is we assess providers against all 205 items. And they get a yes or a no. There is no it depends or maybe. This is a snapshot of the Amazon document. It's 40 pages in length, lots of text, every feature, yes or no, why did they get a yes or a no, and then this interactive Excel file as well. So you can dig tab by tab and see how many of the compute, how many of the network, how many of the support criteria did they meet, and we up-level that with the summary tab that you see on screen, bar charts, caveat diagrams, and so forth. So we're going to kind of unveil a lot of our findings from this research for both the Microsoft and the Amazon in-depth assessment and kind of show you how they overlay and then help guide you towards a decision that you can go back to your office and maybe fast forward and decide which one of the providers might be best for you, or do you actually want to work with both the providers, which is an interesting strategy we'll get into. Okay, here's the scoring. Required criteria is what most people care about. It's a 92% to 75% lead right now. So this gets back to the fact that Amazon's got a lead. There's approximately 100 criterion required, and if you shake out how many different individual items, there's 18 that Amazon gets a yes for that Microsoft does not. 14 in preferred, 11 in optional. Now, there are a couple ways you could look at that. You could say that's a pretty big lead, or wow, that's not that big of a lead after all in required. But when you start looking at preferred and optional, like I said, these are some of the things that are the nice to haves, the differentiators. Oh, wow, that is done a whole lot more elegantly at that provider. You'll see some of those things really showing up in preferred and optional. And you can see that Amazon's got that lead essentially in all the categories that we look at. The other perspective that I really like to take a look at is how has history transpired. So both of these were published in August, so just a couple months old. If we look back at 2013, and I apologize for the small font, you can see the scores that they both got a little bit over a year ago. And again, 2 ways to look at this. You could look at it and say, so they both increased required by about 20 percentage points. Has Microsoft stabilized that gap? And I do think that they have. And Microsoft has the benefit of not being first in this market, and they benefit from seeing what another competitor has done, and they have been able to somewhat emulate, copy, or maybe even improve in some situations what another provider that entered the market has been able to do. Okay, so you could look at it that way. You could also look at it the other way and say, well, it is stabilized, but in the required category, when I look at preferred, it looks like Amazon has improved about 20 percentage points, which they have. But Microsoft's only improved 4 percentage points. And that's interesting because the required criteria are kind of the low-hanging fruit, the things that you have to have. And Microsoft is still picking those off. They've not been able to really build that innovation engine as fast to pick off those preferred and optional criteria. But again, this is a point-in-time snapshot. And in fact, these numbers, if I were to republish this event today, have already changed. Amazon has a couple of additional percentage points since we published this in August. And Microsoft is probably at about 79% just based on my rough analysis because TechEd Europe a few weeks ago, they picked off several more networking items. And so this is an ever-living organism that you're going to have to continuously assess. And just because a provider doesn't have something for you today doesn't mean that they won't have it for you tomorrow. That's just the nature of the way that cloud speed moves. Another way of overlaying this is a caveat diagram, orange being Amazon, blue being Microsoft against each of the required categories. You can see every category Amazon's got a lead on with the exception of one. And if I were to have taken this away and said, hey, what category do you bet Microsoft would have a lead in? I think most of us would probably say support and service levels. It's not a surprise. Microsoft has been in the business for 20, 30 years of working with large, complex organizations, understanding what you need from support and service levels and communication and kind of the concierge level integration. And they have a number of items there that they get a yes for, and we'll talk about those, where Amazon is still lacking. It's just maybe a bit of a different culture, a different approach to the market. So where does Amazon beat Azure? There are 18 items in required. I can't put them all up there. I put some that come up in conversations a lot, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. In fact, I actually have to remove 2 of these from the slide now, the multiple virtual NICs and network segments. Microsoft addressed that 2 weeks ago, and the external network security, ACLs, and firewalls. What we mean there is you have to be able to do this in like a security group and container concept, not at an individual VM by VM level. They've also addressed that in the last 2 weeks. But when we look at rapid self-service provisioning, you might scratch your head and say, well, wait a minute, Azure does that, do they not? Well, yes, they give you self-service, they give you some rapid provisioning, but our definition and the evaluation criteria of what does it mean to get that goes beyond just giving me self-service to a VM or a storage volume. It actually talks about being able to simultaneously provision a large amount of infrastructure with a single or simple transaction, a single API call, a single management interface call. Amazon gives that to you as a flag. If you want to deploy 20 VMs, you set that flag at 20, and off it goes. Azure, you actually have to take an additional step and write a PowerShell script or a loop to loop through 20 API calls. Nothing wrong with that per se, but it's not in the spirit of the criteria that Gartner has heard from our clients, and so that's why we wanted to highlight that one. Data center proximity is, we know cloud is global and many different locations, and both the providers do well there, but we also have a requirement that we hear from our customers that says you actually have to have multiple data centers within a region. This is the availability zone concept of Amazon, so that you can have synchronous replication. You're inside the law of physics, a 100-kilometer radius, to be able to achieve that. Microsoft has got that in some areas, but not everywhere yet. So they're getting to lots of global regions, but within that region, they don't really have the worked out concept of an availability zone set, or as availability zone concept yet. They do have a thing called an availability set. And I want to clarify that because it's different than an availability zone. An availability set means that if I deploy 2 VMs and I put them in an availability set, Microsoft will guarantee that they go to different racks, but still in the same data center. That's fine. That helps you, if a top-of-rack power switch issue happens. It doesn't help you if something happens to that data center, power failure, an ice storm, crane falls on the data center, whatever you can envision. Not likely events, but also something you'd probably like to protect yourself against. They've been able to improve this by having a VNet to VNet architecture where you can actually build VNet bridges across regions to build availability. But then again, if you have to have continuous availability and be within that 100-kilometer radius, you're going to have a problem there. And then the custom tagging and grouping of resources. If you really are advanced into Amazon, I hope you're using tagging. Maybe create a tag that says, we're going to tag every asset we deploy at Amazon with a cost center, a business unit, a project name, and then you can get your bills aggregated in those so you can pass back charges. Microsoft's just recently rolled out the idea of tagging, but they're not integrating it too much within searching and filtering and billing and so forth. So when we define what custom tagging and grouping of resources needs to include, they fall a little bit short there. I won't go into the others. You'll see some of these actually show up when we get to some of the later topics. So where does Azure beat Amazon? It's not as long of a list, but there are some areas in required where they do meet this. From a technical perspective, the one that I like to highlight is expandable block storage volumes. This is on the fly expanding a block storage volume without taking any type of downtime or migration effort. If you know about EBS and you use EBS at Amazon, if it's a 20 gig volume and you need to go to 40 gig, you cannot do that on the fly. They have a nice documentation, white paper explains how you do that. You create another 40 gig volume, you migrate the data, you shut down the 20, you instantiate the 40, and you rebind it. So there's several steps there. Microsoft does actually give you because of their storage architecture, and it is an area that Azure's got a compelling set of features within their storage services that they can do that on the fly for you. The other three are really kind of the soft side, the support and service levels, and it's a reason why in the caveat diagram they had a lead. Microsoft publishes their DR plan and test results, and they will offer it to you under non-disclosure. I've seen the existence of it, and it's comprehensive. This does not mean that Amazon does not have a DR plan for their data centers. I'm sure that they do. What it means is that they do not expose that to you as customers. So when you're doing a security audit, when you're going through a compliance check, and you need to see how is our provider actually doing disaster recovery, how are they protecting our data, how are they set up to recover from some type of issue, you're going to have to see if Amazon will give you a custom conversation or give you a document that we've not been able to validate exists. The other two, we firmly believe, and our clients tell us that we need to know in advance if an SLA is going to change, and in fact, we've kind of heard that 90 days is that sweet spot. So if you're going to change the SLA, customers should have a 90-day notice. What if all of a sudden a provider says, we're going to go from 99.99 availability down to 99.95? You don't want them to spring that on you overnight. That might influence your architecture. That might influence whether or not you stay with the provider. It might actually lead to an exit strategy, exit plan conversation. Microsoft guarantees it, Amazon does not. And then a 60-day service health and SLA history. So this is looking backwards. What has the health of a system or a service at the provider been? The AWS Service Health Dashboard, it's a really nice dashboard, only gives you 35 days of history. It's really hard to figure out whether or not you need to put in an SLA claim, a service problem, a support ticket, when you don't have enough time to go back and look in history. Many of my large customers tell me, we're not even really sure until we get, the bill, whether or not we've been overcharged, or wait a minute, we had a downtime or an outage that month. It takes 2 to 3 months sometimes to be able to figure that out in a large organization. And again, it's a nice little thing that Microsoft gives to you and not currently that Amazon does. So now I'm going to kind of consolidate these findings. I could go through 205 items. You'd fall asleep. I'd fall asleep. It'd probably be a train wreck. But what I've done is I'm going to give you 5 main reasons you would choose Amazon and 5 main reasons you would choose Azure. And each of these are founded upon actual items in our evaluation criteria. So I'm going to up-level that a little bit. So first and foremost, you choose Amazon Web Services if you require significant scalability and automation offerings. You're at reInvent. You've seen their drastic scale. You've seen their advanced automation. It does not mean that Azure doesn't have scalability, does not have automation, but the degree and the level at which Amazon can do that is for the bleeding edge and pushing the envelope. There's not really a surprise why a company like a Netflix or a Pinterest, those that really push scale, are running on top of Amazon. So that would be number one. It's not just virtual machines, though. I like to highlight, we've got a video here I'm going to pop up and show. It's in all of their services. So if you're familiar with DynamoDB, how many of you use DynamoDB? Yeah, okay, so some, but not many. DynamoDB is a non-relational, NoSQL database as a service offering. And what's pretty cool about it, I'm going to describe here, there's 2 lines at the top. The dotted green line is the capacity of the Dynamo database that you have provisioned. So we've provisioned a database that can support up to 1 million objects retrieved per second. And the blue line is the actual traffic that that database is ingesting right now, which is at 400,000. At the bottom is the latency of that database. And what we're going to do, I'll try to narrate this as it goes by. The first thing that's going to happen is we're going to increase the load of that database from 400,000 to 800,000. And you're going to see this blue line increase. It should handle it without a problem because we have provisioned a database that can handle up to 1 million. So you see the blue line spiking there. The most important thing, in my opinion, is down here in the latency. You've just doubled the throughput to that database and have 0 impact on the latency. Any of you that have tried to do that in a database on premise, you know that there's going to be an impact on the latency or the responsiveness of that database. And so that latency stays dead flat. And that's the most important part of this video. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to increase that traffic to 2 million objects per second. And you think, well, wait a minute, we've only paid for provision 1 million objects per second. And so what's going to end up happening is you're going to see a spike up to 2 million and then immediately throttle down to 1 million. Because you're only paying for 1 million. That's all you've provisioned. That's all you're paying for. So it quickly goes up, and then the Dynamo says, nope, we're going to locking you down at 1 million. Again, you've not seen any impact even at that spike to the latency of that database. So, okay, you need to support 2 million objects retrieved per second, so let's increase the capacity on the fly, which again, you're not re-provisioning a database. You're not adding clusters and nodes. And this takes a while because this is a very complex exercise. Imagine the complexity that Amazon has automated on the back end to make this happen. You're going to see a couple of things happen. First and foremost, you're going to actually see the blue line move up to about 1.5 million. DynamoDB is now growing and has reported back and says, okay, I can now safely accept 1.5 million. Now let me go keep configuring, and eventually I'll be able to support 2 million. Still nothing happening to the latency or the milliseconds. So as this scales up, it will go to 2 million. My timing's pretty poor on this. Should pop up there in a second. But you still have not seen the green line move because DynamoDB has decided it's still not safe for me to charge this customer because I'm still configuring it, and some of the last steps are going to be reporting into the billing system that you are now paying for a 2 million object retrieved per second. So they actually give it to you before they start charging you with it, and you will see this very last step, the green line will spike immediately up to 2 million. You're retrieving 2 million, and you're paying for 2 million, and nothing has happened to the latency along the lines. There are manifestations of this type of automation and scalability across all of Amazon services, and I'm not sure how many of you had seen something like this, so I wanted to highlight it there. There are pretty cool things like this at Microsoft as well, but 2 million objects retrieved per second and not having any impact on the network or the latency is pretty astounding. And so it goes on, and I haven't even been able to analyze or assess the announcements this week, but several of them are in automation and scalability. Number 2, you would choose Amazon if you need local and global availability. I won't waste too much time here. Both providers have global availability. Microsoft has like 19 locations now globally. That's a lot. The local is the key. I talked about availability zones a few minutes ago. We publish reference architecture. They're called blueprints in Gartner about recommendations for how you should do things. We have one on availability within Amazon and one within Azure. The important part on here are these availability zone architectures. And because they're within this low latency, co-located region, you're able to do some things with load balancing and with replication of either RDS or DynamoDB or NoSQL databases that you might not be able to do if you pick 2 Microsoft Azure data centers in 2 different regions. The third, you choose Amazon if your business demands a robust marketplace. And I apologize for the number here. Last time I checked, they were over 2,050, and then I heard Andy on Wednesday say 1,900. I went back and checked last night. By my count, there's like over 2,100. And I just popped up some of the more popular ones that we hear about. There is an incredible breadth to the marketplace. Now, again, this is another one of those areas where I have to give Microsoft some credit for some very recent things that they do. They have launched the Azure Marketplace, and I poked around on that a little bit the other night, and they had like 3,100 catalog items. But I don't know if it's a matter of how they're counting them or what have you. There's a number of categories. This may not be as big of a differentiator as it was when I built the deck for our Catalyst conference. But we still hear this as being one of the most sticky items about Amazon. It's the ecosystem. It's about the partners and the providers, and anything I want to get from almost any ISV or IHV is available in the Amazon ecosystem. But Microsoft being Microsoft, they're going to have that too if they don't already have a lot of it today. So this is one of those that is probably quickly disappearing as a core reason. And as a result, I actually added a 6th reason that I'll get into instead of just 5. So the next one is you depend upon the most robust feature set. I've kind of belabored this point a little bit, but 43 is the number. There are 43 individual items across our entire 205 that Amazon gets a yes for, that Microsoft gets a no for. So if you really have to push that envelope, you're probably going to find more of an affinity towards Amazon. A lot of our criteria doesn't even take account for some of the most innovative services that are coming up from these providers. I don't have anything in the evaluation criteria that talks anything about the concept of Lambda. Lambda is kind of blowing my mind right now. So it's not just the current features that we're evaluating, but it's also kind of the innovative feature set and the pace of innovation. And Amazon just continues to do a very good job over that and have been since their existence. And then the final one that I have to put in here is security. And security is not just the traditional sense, but audit and configuration is a really big deal. CloudTrail is just a fantastic service. And all of the partners like a Splunk or a data pipe that wrap around CloudTrail and give you more graphical insight to the visibility of your logs, your API requests. What we saw this week from AWS Config, I'm pretty excited about, giving you more control over the configurations. The data locale control, both providers do a good job with this. Microsoft has one exception. If you're deploying into the Brazil region, Brazil doesn't have a data center pair within South America, so they pair the Brazil data center with Texas. And as a result, if you set up data protection, your data could be replicating into Texas and across international boundaries. And so that's just a minor item, again, something that they'll probably fix, but I had to highlight it. Role-based access control, let's put a pinpoint there because I'll get to that as we're talking about Microsoft, but it really gets into how granular can you grant out individual rights and permissions to a plethora of different services. And then the encryption services and marketplace, Amazon obviously came to market with encryption as a service this week, but also the marketplace and some of the security services, whether it's with a Trend Micro, firewall, some of the antivirus protection services and so forth, very broad system. And we're just hearing for the highest level of security, customers are leaning towards Amazon, but Microsoft's getting very interesting here as well, and they're very aggressive. They got all the compliance and certifications tacked off. They're moving into regions like China and isolating that. They're working on encryption services for storage and so forth. Okay, I ran this presentation as a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and I asked all the attendees, there were about 500 attendees, what's your primary reason for using Amazon? And there were 221 people that responded to this poll, and I'd asked the people to only respond if you really are using Amazon. And so you can see that scalability and availability and that automation and feature set, and a couple of those items that I brought together, really is the overwhelming percentage of why we choose Amazon. But you do see other items that I talked about on these slides. So it's been a very pro-Amazon presentation so far, and I could have done Microsoft first, but we're going to talk about some reasons why you would choose Azure, because there are legitimate reasons, and they're doing a very good job in this market. If you saw the keynote on Wednesday, you saw the Gartner Magic Quadrant that my colleagues have produced and that we've worked on together. Amazon and Microsoft are the only two in the upper right. Amazon's far into the upper right, but Microsoft is now in the upper right as well, and it is a credit to all of the work and the innovation that they've been putting forward. And you could make an argument that we're not all fans of everything that Microsoft does, but I do think we have to give the Azure team and their whole cloud division, the fact that Satya Nadella now leads the entire company, coming from a cloud and mobile grassroots, that they're really focused and committed to this. If you are questioning if Microsoft is committed to this, I could tell you everything I've observed, the answer is yes. So why would you choose Azure? Well, first and foremost, Captain Obvious statement, if you're deeply invested in Microsoft technologies. We're all, most of us, really big Microsoft shops, some significantly larger than others. The more of these items on screen or other Microsoft technologies that you're really intimately involved with and depend upon, the more affinity you will feel towards Azure, because they do a very good job with the integration of Microsoft technologies and the automation of Microsoft technologies. If you want to stand up your own SharePoint farm, you could choose Office 365 as a service, or you could go get a PowerShell blueprint or template that Microsoft gives to you, click a single button, and all your web front ends, your search and query and index servers and so forth, they provision out for you, and then you can customize and tune that to your heart's delight. You could do that with CloudFormation and Amazon or find one in the marketplace, but Microsoft's giving it to you as the sole vendor and provider, and they stand behind that. Some interesting things with System Center. In my opinion, from a true hybrid cloud story, Microsoft's got a good story, probably better than Amazon. Amazon's hybrid cloud concept really revolves around the network and direct connect and some of their storage gateways and so forth. But you want to start talking about seamless management, single pane of glass, seamless experience for your administrators and developers, especially if you're .NET. It's very nice and well put together on-premise and off-premise. And they've been really pushing this envelope here with some recent announcements of kind of like Azure in a box in your data center and so forth. So again, this is number one. This is a really big deal. You'll see that in the polling slide I have in a few minutes. Number two, if you can accept scalability limitations. Now this is getting significantly better, but I put this up here because we're not all Facebook or Netflix. We have to be honest, a lot of us don't need 2 million objects retrieved per second. And in some ways, Azure's a bit simpler for you to digest if you don't have to do that, you don't have to push the envelope. But there are a couple that I'd like to highlight. Like auto-scaling is the heart of cloud services. We need to be able to scale out and scale in. Azure offers it, but in a different way. Currently, one of their limitations is that you have to pre-provision virtual machines, meaning that if you've got a web portal powered by 5 web servers, and you, at the peak of the day or the peak of the month, you need to move to 10 web servers to support the load, you're going to have to pre-provision, kind of in a warm or cold state, another 5 web servers, turn them off, and then you turn them, the auto-scaling policy will turn them on when you need them. It's different than AWS auto-scaling, which you don't have to pre-provision. The auto-scaling policy will provision basically from a dark state and stand them up based on your AMI or your CloudFormation template or so forth. And then furthermore, it's only integrated with CPU monitoring. So that's great if your application is dependent or is triggered by CPU load. If it's RAM utilization, if it's network or disk utilization, you'll find that as a frustration. And so I call that out. No metrics-driven load balancing. Again, something that's improving with Azure, but this is the comprehensive set of all the different metrics that you can trap and direct load based on that. So right now, Azure load balancing is kind of either a round robin or due to network routing improvements, detecting where you're coming at from the world and routing that way. But the most advanced load balancing is really going to look about the utilization and the metrics of each individual node within the load balancing pool and directing. You may have 10 users on this server and 2 over here, but the one with 10 may still have lower utilization, so you'd want to continue to pass users that way. And then role-based access control limitations. They do a great job for storage, but for compute and networking, Azure gives some predefined buckets of like owner or read-only. The other taxonomy is not quite coming to me, but a couple of big buckets. And if you want to really define custom roles, like you want to define your offshore service desk and they have very custom rights, or you want to start saying the service desk has rights to power on and off VMs, but only between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. because that's when everybody in the United States is sleeping, and that's when they're allowed to do it, but we don't want them doing that during U.S. business hours. The complexity of some of that role-based access control are things that you can build into Amazon IAM that Azure is currently lacking. But I'll tell you that freight train is coming with Azure Active Directory and the integration of that within Azure, that there will be a day that Azure may have a better story here, because then you can start to pass in all of your organizational units and your GPOs from on-premise Active Directory and all the parameters that you have about your employees and what groups that they're in and what do they have access to, and reusing a lot of that. So I'm pretty bullish on where they're going, but right now there's some limitations. Number 3, you would choose Azure for infrastructure as a service if you're already using Azure PaaS or Office 365. Now, this isn't a binary decision, but we find a lot of customers that say, we're big Office 365 shop. We've been using Azure PaaS for maybe SQL or .NET development, website hosting. Now we want to start adding some custom infrastructure stuff around it. Something I've heard quite often is we use Office 365 for SharePoint. And that's a standard SharePoint environment if you've used it, and you can't really customize it. So what if you want to bolt on a customized web part to SharePoint? Well, you could go into Azure and build that custom web part and connect it and build it on top. Could you do that with Amazon? You could. Now you're dealing with a multi-provider, the complexity with the network and the integration and the identity and the security across 2 providers. You'd probably just be better off doing that within Azure. So this ecosystem of all the Microsoft Cloud services is starting to be put together quite nicely. This is just a kind of a smattering of different cloud services that they have. And the more of these that you're finding yourself using, the more likely that you're going to want to continue to try to stay within that ecosystem for the seamless, kind of elegant integration. Next item, you choose Azure for if you need a contingency plan for AWS. And we hear this increasingly quite a bit because it's no surprise that Amazon has a very large customer base. So much so that some customers are coming to us saying, you know, we're using so much of Amazon, we're starting to have that risk conversation, that exit strategy conversation, that protection. We can't really mitigate all of our exit strategy or our lock-in risk, but we would like another provider there in the event that something catastrophic, Armageddon were to happen, or we believe that there are certain types of workloads maybe that don't work so well in Amazon and would work better in Azure. And so now we're looking at a dual provider strategy. And I'm a pretty big advocate of that right now. I'm not an advocate of a 10 provider strategy. That's too much. But more than one, whether it's 2 or 3, I think is a pretty good fit, especially the larger of the organization that you have. And then you can invest in building decision-making frameworks, governance policies about where would you properly place each workload based on the characteristics. Most of our shops have had Windows and Linux. It's the same type of concept there. When would you use provider X? When would you use provider Y? In order to do that, you're going to have a relationship with both. And then the final one, and this is a biggie, you would use Azure because it benefits you financially. The bigger a Microsoft customer that you are, the larger the enterprise percentage discount that you get on your EA, and Microsoft's being very strategic here. They're leveraging that Rolodex that they have with all of you as customers. They're coming in, they're saying it's time to renegotiate the enterprise agreement. By the way, we're going to throw Azure onto this for free. Maybe we'll give you 6 free months, $50,000, or we'll pass on that 20, 30, 35% discount that we already give you for other Microsoft technologies. We'll take that discount off the Azure list price. And you start looking at that compared to the prices from Google or Amazon. You're like, wow, 20, 30% off the list price is pretty substantial. The other way in which I hear this conversation, since I talk to the architects and engineers, and this happens all the time, hey, Kyle, my CIO was just told that we've got $50,000 of free Azure, so he's coming to me. He says, you have to go use it. Tell me what you think. And we're already happy with Amazon, but it is free, and I've done my evaluation, and it's not as feature robust as Amazon. I found some things that maybe are not as great, but you know what? It's good enough for a lot of things. And it's cheap, and it's free, and that relationship and premier support that gets bundled into it, and that starts to get packaged together, and you look at a TCO, ROI analysis. This is the Microsoft playbook. This is what they've done with almost everything that they've done in their existence. Very rarely does Microsoft invent a market. A lot of times they see that somebody is onto a breakthrough, in this case cloud. They emulate it, they improve it. It may not be the best product, but they sell it and they market it and they discount it, and over time they become a winner. They've done it with the network operating system and directory services. Anyone remember Novell? Wasn't a better product. They did it with Office suites. There was a time in which Lotus and WordPerfect were significantly better. They did it with email. Lotus Notes at one day, believe it or not, was king, coming from a long-time Lotus Notes user at a corporate America. Gaming, who thought that they were going to be competitive to Nintendo and Sega and Sony? This is what they do, and they do a very good job with it. So if you're questioning whether or not Microsoft's committed to it, you can just look at their history. So when I asked the attendees at this webinar, what is your primary reason for using Azure? Look how dominant the relationship is. Now that relationship probably also includes some of that financial side, even though I called it out separately. That relationship is very important. And what's interesting about Microsoft is they have us all as customers, and I understand that they're not a perfect vendor, but it's rare for us to hear nightmare stories about Microsoft. For the most part, they treat customers well. We use their products and we're locked into their products. What would we all do without Office and emailing documents and PowerPoints between companies? But they've treated us pretty well over the years. And so I think that is no surprise why 64% said, yeah, that's why we use Azure. So I'm going to net it out for us. There's a lot of different information. A couple maybe catchy phrases that will stick with you. I believe you would choose AWS because it's easy and rapid. They do easy and rapid and self-service better than anyone, but you would choose Azure kind of in contrast to that because it's really well integrated. It's really well integrated with the Microsoft ecosystem. You would choose Amazon because of its drastic scale, but you might choose Azure because of their sales. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a very positive way, that their sales cycle and the financial discounts and the relationship and the access that they give you to their teams might be a huge benefit. And you would choose Amazon because it's infrastructure-centric, and you would choose Azure because it's multi-cloud. And I probably need to describe this a little bit. These are different approaches these providers are taking. Amazon has always been kind of that infrastructure-centric Lego block company. We'll give you all the Lego blocks, all the different sizes. I have a 6-year-old at home. He's obsessed, and he builds all kinds of cool stuff. And I love when he does that and doesn't follow the instruction manual. Amazon really gives you that power. It's not that Azure doesn't give you Lego blocks. It's that they take a slightly different approach, and they package some of those Lego blocks into outcomes or multi-cloud things that you can still customize, but it's kind of a marketing and a selling strategy. So I'll give you a good example. Gartner's been doing a lot of research about the Internet of Things, like sensors everywhere, data streaming in all the time. You can achieve an IoT architecture with either provider. Azure has something they call Azure IaaS, which is a pre-built IoT platform of several different types of cloud services. Amazon, you would need to go take Kinesis and DynamoDB and Redshift and maybe Lambda now and put some of these things together and build your IoT platform. Nothing wrong with either one of them. One of those strategies might be more advantageous or sound better to you than the other, and you're only going to be able to decide based on your culture and your organization. Now, I encourage you all to stay tuned here. This is a bit of the sales pitch. We've just finished the Google Cloud Platform Assessment, and it's in our editing organization, so contractually I'm not allowed to share any of the results of that. We'll publish in about 2 weeks. What I can tell you is that their score is behind Azure, because so of the three, Google's going to be third. They're not as far behind as you might think. What's interesting about Google is, remember the left and the right categories, the really technical categories? Google does a great job. Like, they nail network. They do a good job with storage and compute. The soft side, the non-technical, the support, the communication, the service levels, they have some big gaps. And they know they have big gaps. They're going to have to go through that Google Loves Enterprises campaign. Those of you that were at reInvent a couple of years ago, was AWS Heart Enterprises. Amazon over the last several years has really figured out how to be enterprise friendly, and I have to applaud them for it. They really have figured it out. Microsoft's always had that figured out. That's their DNA. Google, when I hear from customers, I hear, is Google really, do they want to work with me? Or are they committed to Google Cloud Platform? Will they do to Google Cloud Platform what they did to Google Reader and just get tired of it? I don't think they will. I think they see the opportunity here. But that, when you see the results of our research, you will see really strong technology and areas of improvement for the non-technical side. So I always wrap up with recommendations. I encourage you, if you've not selected a cloud provider, maybe you have because you're here, or maybe you're here because you're evaluating Amazon, you have to create your unique criteria. We believe we can help as Gartner to give you like the 80% start, and you customize that. And once you've built that, then you have to evaluate your providers. And again, we can put in the hands of you an objective score of Amazon and Microsoft and Google soon, and we'll keep expanding the providers we evaluate. But you're going to have to do it eventually yourself based on how much you configure that. You can trust us. We've done a lot of research that Amazon and Azure are the current criteria leaders. But don't discard the other players. And there might be a reason you choose Google. I hear from IBM customers, hey, we're completely outsourced into IBM data centers. SoftLayer's got some interesting advantages because it's in the same data center. What do you think of that? And I say there's a compelling story there. You may not get the drastic scalability that Amazon gives you. You might not get Lambda for a couple of years, something that's equivalent to that. But if you don't need those things, there might be a reason why IBM or HP or Rackspace or VMware could be options for you. So don't discard those other players, and they're going to compete. I just don't know how well they're going to compete over the future. And then you have to forecast your future requirements. Because it's not a point-in-time strategy, these providers roll, like Amazon said, 500 announcements or features in the last year. Microsoft just rolled out a bunch of things at TechEd Europe like 2 weeks ago that I need to update my deck. But forecast that. And do you really prioritize the feature innovation and the breadth of features, or do you really prioritize the relationship and waiting on a provider to maybe get to that bleeding edge because you're not a bleeding edge type of company? And based on what you desire, that might lead you to one provider over the other. And then if you haven't selected a provider, I encourage you, go do it. What's holding you back? Go do proof of concepts. Do dev and test. If you're a CIO or a senior leader, empower your architects and engineers to go play with this stuff. And if you give them the time to do that, they're going to come back with some cool stuff. And you're going to find business differentiation. You're going to find features and services that you hadn't maybe dreamed up of, but you're going to have to just start doing it. But don't ever sit idle. Don't wait for the cloud to come to you. If you're not convinced that cloud is going to improve your business, I've got some oceanfront property in Nebraska for you. This is the research. So if you're a Gartner for Technical Professionals client, these would be the documents you'd want to go pull. If you're not, we'd love to talk to you about being a client, but I'll pass you off to a sales rep probably down the road. But those are the research. So the evaluation criteria is vendor agnostic. We built that first based on customer requirements. The in-depth assessments is when we go objectively score the providers against that. I've got 2 minutes left, and that's the end of my presentation. So I will take a couple of minutes of Q&A, and then we're going to have to empty out for the next presentation. I'll be in the hallway. So who's got a question? Yeah, back there.
What is your take on the OpenStack community?
Oh, man. So I knew this is, I'm in Vegas. I should have put odds on that because I knew the question was going to come. And there are vendors in this room in the OpenStack community. So let me be very politically correct, but direct. The aim is to be kind of the Amazon competitive framework, right? Especially for private clouds. And yeah, there are public providers running it. In reality, when I talk to large organizations, they tell me how difficult and frustrating it is to get it up and running. And you need an army of engineers to make that happen. Rackspace, HP, some of the providers that do that have hired armies to do it. And that's been the rise now of the distributions of OpenStack. You got Red Hat, you got SUSE, you got HP, and Helion and IBM and like smaller companies like Piston Cloud, and that helps. But you're paying a lot of money for that distribution and filling in all those gaps. So it's not really open source. It's not really a value or a cost play anymore. It becomes something else I buy, and I pay Red Hat as an example to do that. My personal question right now is, given what we're seeing out of Google and Microsoft and Amazon and others, where is the value proposition for a private cloud anymore? Like, are we really going to be able to compete with these companies? Would we be better off standing on the shoulders of giants like an Amazon and figuring out how we mitigate whatever risks live there, rather than spending $1 million in a year trying to build an OpenStack or a VMware or a BMC or a CA, whatever, packaging that all together? It's just a lot of time, effort, and money. So I know many other people have many different opinions, but that's mine. So maybe one more question? That's either good or bad. All right, we'll clear the room out, and then if you have any questions, I'll see you in the hallway.